Nationalism versus patriotism. They're not the same thing. And yet you'll often hear people say in the same breath, I'm a nationalist, I'm a patriot. Yet scholars and political philosophers draw a sharp distinction between these two. Nationalism is the view that the political community in some sense pre-exists the laws, pre-exists the institutions. It's shaped by a unique Geist, a unique spirit of history, customs, place. Sometimes they're ethnic and religious, sometimes racial dimensions, linguistic dimensions to what makes a unique nation, according to nationalists. By contrast, patriots argue that the relevant unit of political life only exists once you have laws and institutions. For patriots, the citizen is the one who loves and strongly identifies with the laws and institutions. So for nationalists, political life in some sense pre-exists laws and institutions. The world is carved up between different peoples, expressive of unique ethnic, linguistic histories. And political life is about nations, unique folk, searching for a state, searching for legitimacy via the apparatus and institutions of the state. Patriotism, as you saw in your reading for today by Charles Taylor, goes back to ancient Greece. And the notion in the Greek polis, in the Greek city-state, that the true citizen is the one who really loves the laws. So think about the ancient Greek world. There was a shared Homeric religion. There was a shared ethnic identity. There was a shared language. And yet politically, what made you belong or not belong was how much you identified with and loved the laws. Were you an Athenian? Did you love and identify with, and were you willing to sacrifice for democratic laws and institutions? Were you a Spartan? Were you a Corinthian? All of these were different legal regimes. Think of Plato's dialogues around the execution of Socrates. A big question is whether or not Socrates is a friend to Athens, a friend to the democratic laws. He always insisted, by the way, that he was. But the controversy and the execution over Socrates, the scandal around Socrates, is whether or not he's a patriot, not whether or not he's a Greek. No one doubts that. So note the big difference between these two models, because for nationalists, you cannot have, by definition, a multilingual, multinational state, because the source of political legitimacy is this unique Geist, this unique folk, this unique race, this unique linguistic unit. And so there's this dark side to nationalist politics, because if you ever have too large a group of another nationalist group within your political community, they're a threat to sovereignty. They could set up their own sovereign. They could set up their own laws. Think of the Gastarbeiter in Germany, right? The Turkish guest workers that are not treated entirely ever like they're part of the German polity. That's a nationalist politics going on. Think of all the anxiety in our own country around Latino immigrants, about language issues, about religious issues, about ethnic and racial issues. Patriotism is, by contrast, not worried about those questions. For patriots, you can have multinational states. For patriots, the question isn't, do you speak this language? The question isn't, are you this ethnic or religious group, racial group, linguistic group? For patriots, the question is, how strongly do you identify with the laws? Okay, you're Latino, but do you civic sacrifice? Do you volunteer for the military? Do you volunteer for office? And so the question for patriots is not what national group you belong to, but whether or not you identify with the laws. Charles Taylor argues convincingly that the American Revolution was a patriotic revolution. The Revolution of 1776 was not a nationalist revolution. Why not? Well, in part because the American revolutionaries didn't distinguish themselves ethnically and culturally from the British. So they weren't rallying around some thick Geist or identity of Americanness over and against the British identity. They were rallying around patriotic notions of the law, of citizen identification with the law. Taylor notes that in the colonies, your cultural identity would have been much more local. You would have been a Congregationalist from Massachusetts, say, or a Baptist from Georgia, and that really would have been the source of your political identity, not whether or not you were part of some ethnic, linguistic group. And so what rallied the revolution was patriotic language. Note that the founders were all cosmopolitans. They didn't care about nation. They cared about a republic of letters, of people who loved certain laws, be they Frenchmen or be they someone from Massachusetts or Georgia. So it was a patriotic revolution. This is so important to see because in some senses, nationalist ideology has swallowed up patriotism, so we don't see a difference anymore. All we see is a unity there. And that's because nationalists believe that the laws are just an expression of a linguistic cultural ethnos. And so they want to break down the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. But as good political theory students, we can't do this. We have to hold up this distinction to see that there are rival theories that have organized society. Patriotism is deeply important, according to Taylor, for multicultural societies, because the question we ought to be asking in multicultural societies is not, does this person eat tacos, or do they speak Spanish, or do they speak English, or do they celebrate and worship at a mosque? The question we ought to be asking is, do they identify strongly with the laws? Are they willing to make civic sacrifices? That's the patriotic question.